Disabled black veteran was bullied in a diner. Then a Navy colonel stood up without saying a word. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Café Meridiano, casting a warm glow across the room. It was a familiar scene, one that had become almost sacred to Manuel Santos. The 72-year-old veteran, his body stiff with the weight of years and a spinal injury sustained long ago, had made this café his sanctuary. Every Sunday for the past decade, Manuel would sit by the window, savoring his breakfast in peace, watching the hustle and bustle of the town square outside. It was his ritual, a small moment of normalcy amidst the constant battle within his own body and mind. Today, as Manuel slowly maneuvered his tray of coffee and a sandwich, the familiar clink of the ceramic mug against the metal tray echoed in his ears. The warmth of the coffee felt good against his cracked, trembling hands, but there was nothing that could soothe the pain that was always present. Physical, emotional, and the weight of memories too heavy to share. His journey from the counter to his usual seat seemed endless, each step a reminder of the decades of invisible scars he bore. But it was the words that cut through the air that day, words meant to humiliate him, that struck the deepest. "If you can't even hold a tray, you should stay home, Grandpa," sneered a man from a nearby table, his voice laced with mockery. A few scattered laughs followed, and Manuel's heart sank. The cruel comment wasn't the worst he had ever heard, but it stung, especially coming from those who had no idea what he had survived. He didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge them. Manuel's shaking hands, not from the words but from the shrapnel embedded in his body from the war, were a reminder of the life he had fought for. Doctors had said he would never walk again. He had proven them wrong, though every day was still a silent battle he fought alone. As he took another step forward, trying to ignore the whispers and stares, another comment flew his way. "Is he trying to get a discount because he's black and crippled?" whispered a woman at the next table, loud enough for everyone to hear. The cruelty in her tone made Manuel's stomach tighten, but he continued his slow march through the café, his focus only on his destination, his seat by the window. He had been coming here for years. 10 years of sitting at the same table, allowing himself the small comfort of routine, of feeling a little less invisible. It was the one place where he could briefly forget the flashbacks that haunted him from the front lines. Where his soul could rest, even if just for a few moments. But today, as he neared his table, his hand trembled harder than usual. The cup of coffee he was holding tipped over, spilling across the tablecloth. A ripple of laughter spread through the café as Manuel froze, wondering whether he should attempt to clean it up or simply sit down. "Has anyone called a janitor?" "We've got an emergency here," someone joked, and more laughter followed. Among the staff, only Elena, a waitress who had served him for years, made a move to help. But her manager, Victor, held her back with a firm grip on her arm, a warning in. The laughter died down when a fork slipped off Manuel's tray, clattering to the floor. The sound seemed to echo, freezing the moment. Manuel's body tensed in pain as he slowly bent down to retrieve it, using the edge of the table to support himself. His knees screamed in protest, but he didn't let it show. 50 years of military discipline kept his dignity intact, even as the café turned into a circus of mockery. A teenager, already holding up his phone, smirked. "Someone should film this for TikTok. It'll be epic." Manuel's face was stoic as he lowered himself. But no one saw the man in the far corner of the café, watching intently, a silent observer among the chaos. Commander Eduardo Fernandez, 45, a Navy officer in full uniform, had stopped in for a quick coffee before heading to an official ceremony. His eyes had followed Manuel's every move since the moment the older veteran had entered the café. There was something about the man, something familiar. The way Manuel carried himself despite the years of pain, the subtle strength in his struggle. It reminded the commander of something buried deep within him. As Manuel reached down for the fork, the commander stood. The scrape of his chair across the floor snapped the café back to attention. His steps were deliberate, unwavering. He crossed the room, ignoring the sneers and whispered jabs. "Look, the Navy rescue team has arrived," one man mocked, but Commander Fernandez didn't respond. His eyes never wavered from Manuel. When he reached the older veteran, Fernandez didn't immediately offer help. He respected Manuel too much to assume he needed it. Instead, he did something that left the entire café in stunned silence. The commander raised his hand in a perfect salute. The gesture was not one of pity but one of profound respect, a military greeting that spoke volumes more than any words could. Manuel, who had kept his gaze fixed on the floor, finally looked up. The two men locked eyes, a silent understanding passing between them. Neither spoke, but in that moment, something deep and unspoken was communicated. The recognition of shared history. The bond of brotherhood that transcended time, rank, and even skin color. And just like that, the cafe fell completely silent. The tension in the cafe hung thick in the air, broken only by the sound of a chair scraping across the floor. Everyone was waiting for something to happen, but no one expected the quiet, respectful gesture from Commander Fernandez. He lowered his hand from the salute, keeping his back straight and his eyes never leaving Manuel's. Then, with deliberate care, the commander bent down, picked up the fork from the floor, and gently placed it on the table. The room held its breath. "Sergeant Major Manuel Santos," the commander said, his voice clear, filling the room. "It's an honor to meet you here, sir." The use of "sir" sent a ripple of discomfort through the crowd, especially among the group who had mocked Manuel moments earlier. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure how to react. Manuel, who had remained silent and composed through the entire ordeal, slowly straightened up. "Commander Fernandez," he replied, his voice steady but low. "Your parents chose your name well. Eduardo, guardian in Old Portuguese." A slight smile tugged at his lips, though there was no joy in it. Always true to that meaning. The manager, Victor, walked over quickly, trying to smooth things over with a forced smile. "Commander, may we offer you your coffee on the house today? And for you as well, Mr. Santos." The commander didn't even acknowledge Victor's offer. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on the manager, his voice unwavering. "Now you're concerned about the well-being of Sergeant Major Santos after allowing him to be ridiculed in your establishment?" Victor's smile faltered, but he said nothing. Manuel looked at the manager and interrupted with a calmness that only came from years of enduring disrespect. "It's not necessary, Commander. Mr. Victor has always been consistent in his priorities." The group of wealthy customers who had laughed at Manuel now shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his gaze. But one man, Jason Porter, dressed in an expensive suit, stood up, his voice now cautious. "So, you really did serve?" he asked. "In what unit?" "Sergeant Major Santos served in Operation Desert Storm as part of the Special Forces," Commander Fernandez answered without hesitation. "But that was just the end of an extraordinary career." Manuel's eyes were steady, his gaze unflinching as he finally took a seat at his usual table, nodding a silent thank you to the commander. 27 years of service," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But no one ever asked me that before. They just assumed." In the kitchen, Elena, the waitress, had been watching the scene unfold. She sent a quick message to her nephew, Vim, who worked as a lawyer. "He's here, the man from your stories, and he has a commander with him right now." Vim wasted no time. He grabbed a folder of documents and rushed to the cafe. Upon arrival, he approached Manuel with respect, his heart pounding. "Sergeant Major Santos, I am Vim Ramos, son of Corporal Miguel Ramos. My father served under you." Manuel studied him for a long moment. "Little Vim," he said, his voice softening. "You were 5 years old the last time I saw you at your father's funeral." Vim nodded. "Yes, sir. I've been working on the case as promised." He slid a document across the table to Manuel. "We found the evidence. The lost records exist. The forged orders. The altered statements. Everything." Manuel's gaze never wavered. "The undocumented mission," he said quietly. "The one that cost the lives of 17 men, including your father." Jason Porter, who had been listening in, stood abruptly. He was pale now, his expensive suit feeling too tight around him. He attempted to leave, but Commander Fernandez recognized him immediately. "Jason Porter," the commander said, his voice hard. "Vice President of Meridian Security Contractors." "Porter." The air in the cafe grew thick with anticipation as the journalists filed in, their cameras already clicking away. Manuel sat motionless, a steady calm in the storm of chaos around him. Every eye in the room was trained on him, but he seemed unfazed, as though this moment had been a lifetime in the making. 17 men died, Manuel said, his voice strong and clear, filling the room with the weight of his words. 17 men with families, dreams, and futures, sent on an illegal mission to protect private interests, then abandoned when things went wrong. His eyes locked onto Jason Porter, who stood near the exit, trying to maintain his composure, but failing. "I'm not here for revenge," Manuel continued, his voice steady but filled with quiet power. "I'm here for justice." Porter's face twisted with panic. "You don't understand," he muttered, his hands trembling as he adjusted his tie. "Those contracts keep our economy running. People will lose their jobs." His voice was high with desperation, but the room's reaction was far from sympathetic. The journalists watched in silence, their cameras trained on him as if waiting for him to slip further. 17 families have already lost so much more, Manuel replied, his voice unwavering. At that moment, Vim opened his laptop, revealing classified documents that had been declassified just days before. The images of military records flickered on the screen, operation reports that had never existed, signatures forged by the hands of the guilty, and, most damning of all, a recording of Porter's father, ordering the abandonment of wounded soldiers to protect Meridian's interests. The café fell deathly quiet as the truth slowly sank in. Jason Porter's expression grew more frantic as he realized the magnitude of what was unfolding. He moved toward the door, but it was too late. 2 federal agents stepped inside, blocking his exit. "Jason Porter," one agent said, his voice cold. "We have a warrant to seize documents from Meridian security contractors related to Operation Ghost." Porter's face turned crimson. "You can't do that," he shouted, his panic rising. "My father built that company. We have government contracts." Manuel, calm as ever, turned to face him. "He built it with blood. Ours." The room fell into a stunned silence. The journalists stared in disbelief as the reality of the situation unfolded before them. Meridian's empire was crumbling, piece by piece, under the weight of a truth that had been hidden for far too long. As the federal agents moved to arrest Porter, the door to the café opened once again. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, the families of the soldiers lost in the operation. They carried photos of their loved ones, posters demanding justice. The sight of them, standing together in solidarity, was a visual testament to the decades of pain and silence finally being broken. Vim stood beside Manuel, watching the scene unfold. "You planned this all," Vim said softly, his voice filled with awe. "You knew this day would come." Manuel nodded, his eyes focused on the scene outside. "I wasn't waiting for justice, Vim. I was waiting for them." He paused, turning to face the crowd in the café. "This café is only 2 blocks from Meridian's headquarters. I knew it was only a matter of time before our paths crossed." As the federal agents led Porter away, the journalists turned their cameras to the crowd outside, capturing the faces of the families who had long waited for this moment. The weight of their grief and the strength of their perseverance was evident in every tear and every look of determination. For 30 years, Manuel had been nothing but a quiet, invisible figure, humiliated and mocked by the very people who had the power to change things. But today, he was the man who brought down an empire built on lies. His patience, his quiet resolve, had shattered the silence and sparked a fire that would not be extinguished. Justice was not an immediate storm, but a relentless tide that had finally swept everything away. And as Manuel stood, his eyes meeting those of the people who had ridiculed him for so long, he knew that the fight was not over. It had only just begun. The room was thick with tension, but the true battle was unfolding outside the café, where families of the fallen soldiers had gathered in quiet solidarity. They carried photos of their loved ones, their faces etched with loss but filled with a quiet strength. Their presence was not a protest, it was a reckoning. The truth, long buried, was now out in the open, and the weight of it pressed down on every person in the café, from the reporters to the once comfortable customers who had laughed at Manuel. Inside, Manuel remained seated, his calm demeanor never wavering. He had waited for this moment for decades. While the world had ignored him, mocked him, ridiculed him for being a disabled black man who spent his Sundays alone at a cafe. He had been watching, gathering evidence, preparing. For 30 years, he had been a ghost, unseen by the powers that be, but now the truth had caught up with them, and it was impossible to ignore. Vim stood by his side, his face filled with respect and pride for the man who had silently fought so many battles. "You knew this would happen, didn't you?" Vim asked, his voice low. Manuel's gaze was focused, but his voice steady. "I wasn't waiting for justice. I was waiting for them to come here, to make their move. I knew it would happen eventually. This place," he gestured to the cafe, "is too close to Meridian's headquarters. I watched them for years, and I knew someone would slip up. All I had to do was wait." The significance of Manuel's words hung in the air. This was no coincidence. The orchestrated silent war he had waged, waiting, watching, planning, had been years in the making. It wasn't revenge he sought, but accountability. For him, justice was never a rush. It was about patience, about endurance, about outlasting the system that had overlooked him for so long. Outside, the crowd had grown. The families of the 17 men who had died in that illegal operation stood united, holding their signs and photos high. Their presence spoke volumes. It was no longer just one man fighting for justice. It was an entire community that had been ignored, silenced, and now, finally, was demanding to be heard. The journalists, now fully aware of the magnitude of what had just transpired, turned their cameras from Porter to the crowd. The stories that had been buried for decades were being rewritten in real time. The federal agents had taken Porter away, but his empire was already crumbling. Meridian security contractor stock was dropping, their government contracts beginning to slip away as the truth spread like wildfire. Manuel's calmness was a stark contrast to the chaos around him. He had waited so long for this moment, knowing that it would come, but never rushing it. Now, as the world began to see what he had been quietly building, his thoughts remained on the families outside, the families who had lost so much, who had waited as long as he had for this truth to be revealed. At that moment, Elena approached, looking at Manuel with a mix of apology and admiration. "I should have helped you earlier," she whispered, her voice filled with guilt. Manuel, ever the gentleman, simply replied, "It's all right, Elena. Not everyone can risk their livelihood for doing the right thing." The crowd outside had grown to a large group now, and their voices were starting to be heard, not just in the cafe but in the streets. What no one had realized was that this moment, the revelation of the truth, wasn't just about the fall of Meridian. It was about the triumph of those who had been ignored, the veterans who had been silenced, the families whose pain had been disregarded, and the man who had waited so long to bring their voices into the light. The reporters, who had once paid no attention to Manuel, now recognized the power of his story. The quiet strength that had kept him coming back to this cafe, week after week, year after year, had not only given him the patience to wait but had allowed him to see things others couldn't. His mission was complete, and it had been achieved without a single angry word. His dignity, his perseverance, had brought down an empire built on lies. As the day wore on, and the press conference loomed, the mood in the cafe shifted. It was no longer the place where Manuel had been mocked and ignored. It had become. 6 months had passed since that life-changing morning at Café Meridiano. The café, once a quiet place of humiliation for Manuel Santos, had transformed. A new sign now hung at the entrance, Veterans Café. The atmosphere had shifted from one of mockery to one of reverence. Behind the counter, framed on the wall, was a photo of Sergeant Major Manuel Santos, his weathered face marked by years of struggle but now immortalized as a national hero. The day was bright, the sun streaming through the window just as it had so many years before. But now, when Manuel walked in, the warmth wasn't just from the sunlight, it was from the respect he had earned and the legacy he had built. Elena, who had been promoted after the scandal, smiled as she guided Manuel to his usual table. "Welcome back, Sergeant Major," she greeted him warmly, a deep respect in her eyes. This was no longer the café that had laughed at him, the café where he had been humiliated. It was a place of honor, not just for Manuel, but for all who had served. But there was a new addition to the café. The table by the window, where Manuel had always sat alone, now bore a small bronze plaque, reserved for Sergeant Major Manuel Santos, national hero. It was a small gesture, but it symbolized the profound transformation that had taken place. Manuel sat down, his hands still trembling slightly from the effects of his injury, his spine still stiff from years of wear. But there was a lightness in his eyes, a sense of peace that had eluded him for most of his life. For decades, he had carried the weight of the lost soldiers, the burden of being unseen, of being ignored by a system that had forgotten him. Now, that burden had been lifted. The truth had been revealed, and justice had been served. Vim, now officially representing the families of the 17 soldiers lost in that secret operation, entered the cafe. Behind him were 3 older men, the remaining survivors of the mission. Their faces were lined with age and hardship, but there was a quiet pride in their eyes as they approached Manuel. "The compensation agreements have all been signed," Vim said, placing a folder on the table. "The families will finally have some financial justice. It's not much, but it's something." He paused, looking at the veterans who stood beside him. "Nothing can truly compensate for their losses, but at least they have their dignity now." One of the veterans, Samuel, squeezed Manuel's shoulder. "You never gave up. When all of us lost hope, you kept fighting." Manuel's eyes softened. "I had no choice," he replied simply. "I promised our brothers that the truth would be known." Just then, the door opened again, and in walked Commander Eduardo Fernandez, now accompanied by an older Navy officer, an admiral. The room fell silent as they approached Manuel's table, the weight of their presence undeniable. The admiral stepped forward first, offering a formal salute. "Sergeant Major Santos," he said, his voice carrying the authority of the Navy. "I've come to inform you personally that your rank will be restored in our official records, with all benefits retroactive. More importantly, the combat medal you were denied will finally be awarded in a ceremony next week." Manuel nodded slowly, his face impassive. It wasn't recognition that had driven him all these years. It wasn't the praise of others. It had always been about the truth. But even so, there was a sense of closure in that moment. The institution that had once turned its back on him was now making amends. "And Porter?" Manuel asked quietly, his gaze steady. Vim answered, his voice low. "His father confessed everything, hoping to reduce his sentence. Jason is facing charges of obstruction of justice and destruction of evidence. Meridian Security Contractors has lost all its government contracts." As the Admiral and Commander Fernandez left, the cafe slowly came back to life. The conversations resumed, but the air had changed. It was no longer a place of mockery, it was a place of healing, of